Once upon a time, there was slavery. Then Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and all the slaves were free. And we fought a war to free the South. The end. Once upon a time, the blacks were oppressed by segregation and the Jim Crow South. Then Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his I Have a Dream speech, and President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill, and they all lived happily ever after. The end. If you read history in school, this is kind of the story you get. You may get something slightly more complex than that in high school, if it's a decent one. But unfortunately, it creates a very larger-than-life caricature of these people. Because of this, we hold these American gods in awe and reverence as something we could never do. We just have to wait for another hero for things to change. This is incredibly useful to the status quo. Waiting ensures change comes even slower. In studying any rights movement, learning about the leader who changed everything is the worst possible thing to learn about it. Every single rights movement ever has had a large, complex network of individuals working hard under the surface to produce change. Working long, hard, and thankless hours, many times seeing little to no traction for decades. Abolitionism has been around since the time of Elizabeth I, and women's rights in the US were first advocated by Abigail Adams and hoped their rights would be codified into the Constitution, which of course they weren't. While suffrage at that time would have been a dream come true, Abigail specifically asked her husband to allow women the right to own property, which he condescendingly mocked her in a "that's so cute" statement. Lincoln actually claimed he had no intention of eliminating slavery upon entering the presidency. He upheld returning runaway slaves to the South, and the Civil War propaganda near the beginning said nothing about slavery, otherwise the anti-slavery, yet still highly racist North wouldn't go fight. This was especially true in Kentucky and Maryland, the two slave states that stayed in the Union. He was against slavery, but also a bit racist himself. He was only able to end slavery because he could spin it as a military tactic, as an advantageous situation arose, where slaves who ran away were now given citizen status if they fought for the Union. It's something he wanted to do, but he could only do it when the situation arose. The South viewed this as a war crime, as it was considered plunder. Elizabeth Cady Stanton helped start the women's suffrage movement in 1848. With decades of hard work, she was actually stripped from the history of the movement because she was an atheist, and they worried it would make them look bad. Susan B. Anthony is the member people remembered more, who also did a lot of work. The 19th Amendment wasn't ratified until 1920, after they both died. Everyone knows of Martin Luther King Jr. The man did great things. He was an eloquent speaker. He was an amazing organizer. And he was great at negotiating with competing factions in his group. He understood human psychology quite well as marketing. However, everything he did pales in comparison with the massive amount of work the people before him did, thanklessly, tirelessly, and under threat of lynching. Just like with the peasants of old, you will never hear about them or their names. If you want to learn about the civil rights movement and how it went from an impossible situation to an achieved endgame, you really need to ignore Dr. King entirely until the end. He was just the culmination of decades of hard work people rarely talk about. They don't make for good stories. They often never saw the success of their work. Some helped out just as much as they could, and some spent their lives working on it. Just like how the president is the representative of the giant mass of people of the United States working hard to make this nation great, Dr. King was just the representative of the civil rights movement at that time, with a large network of other workers raising awareness in the public mind. W.E.B. Du Bois, a man most Americans have no clue about, hoped to be the Martin Luther King of the early 1900s, but he failed, mostly due to lack of organization and public sentiment. But because of him, the movement inched forward ever more, along with countless other people and better organization skills. They took cases to court to sue against discrimination and won every time, but people still kept discriminating because their patrons loved helping someone they viewed as a victim of a Negro lawsuit. As they didn't succeed where King did, you won't hear a mention about them unless you do some actual African American studies. People want to hear stories about the victor, even though failure is essential for any movement long term, so you can learn and grow. Another way King's deified narrative is warped is that most of history focuses on just the civil rights movement. 50% of what the man did was union organizing and strikes, and he was also big in the anti-war movement. But as this is inconvenient for people in power, the stories about him just focus on his civil rights record. He believed that unless blacks and all other people had good-paying jobs through collective bargaining, all the rights in the world would still leave blacks in poverty, as it's been showing lately. Big heroes like these are great people to look up to, but if you deify them too much, it makes people think that no one can do this, and we must continue to wait around for a messiah for things to change. This is one of the reasons why some are shocked when Obama acts like a politician as opposed to a savior, and some can't see his flaws, because they aren't politically engaged enough to question. Deifying great people ensures the truth of what we can and can't do is actually swapped. The chance of you being a big star or wealthy is staggeringly low, but we're taught to believe that it is something that any of us can do, and we actually want it, and it's the best thing to happen, even though so many have such a poor track record of downward spirals. The chance of an individual scientist discovering something to change the very fundamentals of science at this point in our knowledge is incredibly tiny, and even ridiculously less so for a non-scientist. Scientists must spend all their lives to work hard and change what we know about science by a tiny amount. The others who make the biggest discoveries get Nobel Prizes, but even they have a large staff doing research, and what they did only tweaks what we already have discovered about science in a tiny way. A person with an internet and Google is not going to spot the flaw in the entirety of science to cause science to do a complete about-face, because the average person doesn't realize that invention requires creativity, but science requires evidence. Deification gives false hope and restricts people's awareness of what they can do. People are terrible at probability, which is why they feel their efforts can't do anything Martin Luther King or Susan B. Anthony did. The power that people have when they know what they're up against, and that activism is a long game and not a short one, can change the world. However, most don't have the first clue of how the system works to change things. Please watch the videos on my channel What is Activism to have a better understanding of how the system works and how to change it. You probably won't be rich or famous. Your chances of changing science are even lower without a science degree. But something everyone can do is use their energy to change the injustices they see in the world, just like the hallowed leaders of the rights movements did.